Alright guys, let's talk about this DYS Samguk motors. I've been running these things. I have a set of Shus and a set of Weis. And for a while I was having, a time figuring out how they got them so cheap. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one to complain about good stuff, but the thing is, usually with, a lack of price, a small price tag, comes problems. So, the long and short is this. I've put these things through crashes. I have banged the hell out of the bells. I've banged the hell out of the shafts. There is nothing I can find that is inherently wrong with these motors, except the bearings. So today we are going to show you how to swap out the bearings. Alright, in order to do this we're going to need a couple things. The first are your motors. Now I'm going to go ahead and use my spare motor rather than fighting with my quad on camera here to get at its motors, and it'll just make it easier to manipulate while I'm doing all this so that you guys can follow along. Now, you're going to need a small punch of some kind. You're going to need preferably a paper clip or a small piece of wire, like I've got here. And you are going to need your replacement bearings. Now, the last thing that you're going to need, more than likely, are replacement C-clips. Because when you go to tear these things off of here, let me show you something. Let's see if that'll zoom in. That's a C-clip. And when you go to take those off of the existing motor, they are more than likely going to bend out of shape and will never work correctly again. Now, these are real cheap, but I hate these things. So what I've gotten are E-clips. Okay? I intend to use these going forward because they're much easier to get off and to get back on. But apparently the bag is really hard to get into. There we go. Go ahead and get just one of these out. Now, for every motor, you're going to need two bearings, one for the top and one for the bottom. Now, what I went with here, I went with Boca Bearings, and I went with that part number. Now, I did that because these are the cheapest bearings that they sell. That does not mean that these are going to hold up well or be the best bearings for this. It just means that I wanted to make sure that I had the right bearings before I committed to spending a whole bunch, and we'll get to see how well these do. Alright, now the punch that you use should be able to get, so this one's just a little big, should be able to get into the middle of the bearing. And I'll show you why in a second. So the first thing you're going to need to do is pop off the C-clip that's on here. Now, in order to do that, what most people will do is just grab a flathead screwdriver and just get it underneath there and just pry it off. Now, if you intend on reusing these, this is not the method that you're going to want to use. You're going to want to get a C-clip puller, remover, or make a set. You can find videos all over YouTube, but this is not what you're going to want to do. There we go. Now, once you get that off of there, the bell will pretty much pull right off of the stator as I'm pulling off my heat shrink. Now, it can be a little tough. There we go. Because these magnets are, pretty strong. And once you do that, that's where this little piece of wire comes in. What we want to do is to put a small bend, and it's got to be small because it's got to fit down the middle or the shaft of the bearing. sorry, down the middle of the bearing where the shaft would go. Now ideally we want these to line up pretty good. Doesn't have to be 100%, but the closer you are to them lining up, the better this is going to work. I'm going to bend these so they have just a little bit of spring. There we go. And make sure these are kind of 90 degrees-ish. Alright, so this is what we should end up with. When you bend your paper clip or your piece of wire, they should be in a shape like this. And what we're going to do is insert this until you feel a click, and at which point you can try pulling and the bearings may come out. And if pulling doesn't work, that's where you're going to need something that fits down in here. It's going to catch the lips of those, ideally, and that's why a that's why a paper clip works better than a small piece of crummy wire, because they hold up better. And essentially, when you insert this up the center of the bearing, what it's going to do, because there's a small gap between the bearings, is get in there. And then when you insert something down the shaft to push, you're going to have something for that to catch on. So anyway, let's try this again. And you just have to work at this. It's a little bit of a trial and error thing, unless you've got the right tools. Which we don't always, right? But you should kind of feel this click into both sides. See, it's in that recess in there now. Now what's funny about these motors is, on a couple of these, my bearings literally pop right out. I don't even have to do anything tricky. They just kind of slide out. They're not supposed to do that, but they do. The hardest part of this is getting the first bearing out. After that, believe it or not, this gets quite a bit easier. There we go. Alright, and so what we're able to do is use this almost, like a bearing puller. Come on. And just kind of pull that out of there. Now at this point, there's actually more room for you to come from this other side, and you can use a larger punch or something to go ahead and get that one out of there. Let's see if I can get it started here. Be careful not to destroy your stator. So, alright, I'm using a plastic table here as my workbench, so there's not much structural value. So I just went out and found something, a lot sturdier, and the bearings started coming right out. Okay, there's your old bearings. I would just throw those away. And then you take your new bearings, and these literally are press fit. So all you really have to do carefully is get them lined up and press them in where the old bearings came out. Now, I would not advise banging on these ones. See, the thing is, when we're banging on those old ones, we don't intend on using them for anything. So we're not worried about damaging them. But with these, now you can use a vise or anything. I've even seen people just make small, in fact I might do that, small tools out of M3 nuts. Tell you what, I'm just tightening this down. Should seat these bearings. There we go. That top one started to seat, and then I ran out of room, so I'm going to go to the next size down. Use a little ingenuity. This doesn't have to be any harder than you want to make it. I'm just being a little creative, using what you have, being smart, not tear anything up while you do it. Now once either one of these seats, the other one will start to press in. There, I can see the bottom one going in now. Now, when you're doing this, you don't want to go getting all real tight or anything. You just want to put these in until they're not moving anymore. But they don't have to be tight. They just have to be seated. Basically, flush, okay? So I'll show you with this one, since the top one's seated. That's nice and flush across the top there. Nice and flush. Now we're trying to get this one the same way. And so I'll finish what I was doing here. I'm going to use my pliers to hold that still, since I ran out of depth on my socket. And then without damaging anything, I'm just going to hold on to that nut and seat this bearing. There. The second I got a little bit of resistance, I stopped. Knowing that it was seated, I mean, you're going to get a little bit of resistance just in the process of seating these. And that's because you want them to be in there nice and tight. Okay, now with that done, we're just going to take our bell and watch your fingers. We're just going to get that installed back on the stator. There we go. Now, I got extra C-clips in my bag of hardware from DYS. You see them in there. And so all we need to do is take one of those C-clips, and you want to be very careful about this, and you just kind of want to work it over the shaft, because you don't want to bend it. These things, they do have some spring, but because they're made out of such thin material, they will bend out of shape really fast, and then not necessarily easily go back into shape. So just take your time and try not to destroy your C-clip while you're installing it. So once you start to get it over that shaft, it should click into place fairly easily. Now the reason we do this is to prolong our motors, give them life once they start wearing out, because the rest of these, I mean, yeah, if you bend a bell or bend a shaft or something like that, there's not much you're gonna do. And some motor manufacturers sell shafts or bells or the entire bell assembly, you know, with the shaft installed. But other ones don't. And in the case of these budget motors, we can take a really cheap motor that, for all intents and purposes, is built pretty well, except for the bearings, and we can give them new life when you're ready by installing new bearings. There we go. So it takes a little fiddling to get that on there. And again, the big thing is just not to bend it while you're doing it. And I'm giving it a good pull. And there, we've got new bearings. So I will provide links to the bearings down in the video description. This same concept can be applied to any motor, replacing any bearing. Happy crashing.